In this session, I'm going to build from the first session and touch on a number of topics. Let's start with meetings. First, the ones where many Indigenous leaders meet with many provincial government folks. Let's start with the Union of BC Municipalities Convention. Once a year, usually in September, Cabinet and Ministry Executive are invited to attend the UBCM convention. It's usually held in Vancouver, Whistler, or Victoria. First Nations governments are increasingly attending the convention as self-governing bodies and as part of regional districts. This is an opportunity to corner many ministers in one place. While local government representatives go through the week of meetings and presentations that make up their annual convention, Cabinet ministers take the opportunity to meet with mayors and chiefs and councils and regional boards from around the province for very brief, 20-minute meetings. Ministers, supported by their ministry executive and their senior ministerial advisors, often have more than 20 meetings per day for the 3 days of the convention. You can also ask to meet separately with ministry executive. But because the meetings are so short, there's barely enough time for introductions. The best that can happen is that an issue is identified and a commitment made for future meetings. Then there's the BC Cabinet and First Nations Leaders Gathering. Cabinet uses this annual session to meet with First Nations leaders from around the province. It combines breakout sessions on specific topics with the opportunity to meet individually with ministers and deputy ministers. Now, let's talk about one-to-one meetings. There will be times when a chief and council need to have a face-to-face with a minister. And there is no point in asking ministry staff, that is, deputy minister and down, to arrange it. They're supposed to tell you to contact the minister's office directly. That's part of the division between the political and public service worlds. The minister operates his or her office independently of the ministry. Do let ministry staff know that you're asking for a meeting. It's a courtesy because as soon as a meeting is requested, ministry staff are asked to put together a briefing note for the minister. When I'm helping Indigenous organizations, I'll often draft a briefing note for them to include with their meeting request. The idea, apart from giving everyone a heads up on the intent of the meeting, is to get your own key messages out there in a format that government understands. You want them to be able to cut and paste your words into their communications. There's a pretty standard briefing note format for government with some minor variations, 1 to 2 pages maximum. That's a different discussion, and I cover it in session 3 of the How to Brief Your Boss audio podcasts that are also on my website. And that podcast is aimed primarily at provincial government employees, but has some useful stuff for others. Most ministers' meetings are half an hour, and First Nations groups generally get at least an hour. And the deputy or assistant deputy will be there to support the minister and often the senior staff you've been dealing with. I should also talk about written communications with a minister. When you write a letter to a minister, it's immediately rerouted to the ministry with a request to prepare a response. The ministry then sends the letter to its staff member who's the subject matter expert. So if, for example, you're diplomatically complaining about the conduct of some negotiations, the person you're complaining about will probably write the response, and everyone above them in the hierarchy will edit it, but do know that's where it's going. Once approved by the assistant deputy minister and the deputy, the letter goes to the minister's office, where it's reviewed by the senior ministerial advisor and put in front of the minister for signature. If the minister has questions, they'll ask for a briefing from staff, which will trigger a briefing note, which will be presented at a regular weekly briefing of the minister. And those briefing materials can be requested under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, but they're usually carefully worded, and any potentially sensitive bits are provided in person at the minister's briefing. And that takes me to how the provincial government makes major decisions. Government makes thousands of decisions a day, and almost all of them are made at the staff level based on established policy and procedure. Decisions that may affect Indigenous interests are, of course, subject to Indigenous consultation. The decisions that aren't covered by existing policy get pushed up the ladder, and significant financial decisions or controversial decisions that will set important precedents are routed to cabinet committees. So, say you're meeting with ministry staff and one of the points of discussion is a proposal for the province to share revenue from a new resource project with affected First Nations. Revenue sharing is one of those things that's usually approved on a case-by-case basis, especially if it sets some kind of precedent. Staff will take the request away, brief their minister in person and with a briefing note, and ask the minister for permission to request approval from Treasury Board. Then, staff go back to their desks and they draft a detailed package known as a Treasury Board submission. The staff that support Treasury Board review the draft submissions in detail, and the submission will probably have to go to a Cabinet Committee on Natural Resources before Treasury Board to make sure it's reasonably consistent with the work and precedents the other resource ministries are setting. Now, Treasury Board agendas fill up quickly, and it can take several months before a submission is finally considered. And, as I mentioned, cabinet confidence rules legally prevent staff from giving you the timing details, which can be frustrating. You won't be invited to speak to cabinet or cabinet committees to brief them on a submission. No one other than deputies and assistant deputies do that. Depending on the issue, you might find it useful to meet with the minister responsible for the specific issue you're dealing with, as well as the minister responsible for Indigenous relations and your MLA, especially if your MLA happens to be a minister and therefore part of the decision-making process in cabinet. I talked about the public service in the first session and how it's different than the political world. So, what's the formal role of the public service? And remember, that's not the people that work in the minister's office or constituency office. It's the people that work in the ministries at and below the deputy minister level. I'm going to quote a paragraph from an article by David Good of the UVic School of Public Administration. Quote, "The role of the public service is to support the government of the day, to carry out and implement its programs, its commitments, and its agenda. There are two parts to this. One is to tender professional, non-partisan policy advice to ministers. In short, the job is to speak truth to power, to be frank and candid in policy advice. This requires that deputy ministers and staff have policy competence and can fashion policy advice that is relevant and useful to their ministers. The other part is to be loyal and effective in implementing policies and programs once they have been decided by ministers and cabinet, irrespective of the policy advice that was tendered by the public service. Public servants are, and must be, politically sensitive, but not partisan." End of quote. That's what the public service has been about for hundreds of years, which is why I think the term public servant is misleading. Government servants would be more accurate. And now you know more about the formal role of the public service than most public servants. Okay, so that's an overview of the formal stuff. Now, let's go over some background about the evolution of land use and natural resource policies in BC. I spent most of my career before I was an assistant deputy minister in the management of Crown land, or more appropriately, the unceded traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples living in what we now call British Columbia. But for this session, because I'm talking about how the provincial government works, I'll use the terms that the government uses, with my apologies. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, government encouraged the purchase of Crown land to settle the province, and a lot of that was through preemption, the technical term for homesteading in BC. But through the mid-20th century, government's goal shifted to protecting the resource industries that were generating most of the government's revenue, forestry and mining. And as a result, in the last half of the 20th century, the province shifted its emphasis away from responding to random applications for Crown land to programs that managed forestry and mining as a first priority. And after losing a long series of court decisions on Aboriginal rights, the province grudgingly accepted that it's obliged to address Indigenous rights and title interests when considering the disposition of Crown land. So, big picture, 94% of BC is so-called Crown land managed by the province, and 83% of that is designated as provincial forest, meaning that it's dedicated to forestry uses, and much of that same land is also covered by mineral claims. Over the years, the Public Service developed binders full of Crown land disposition policies written for specific land uses like agriculture and mining, and tweaked them slightly in response to new governments, court decisions, and lobbying from industry and interest groups. The policies give potential Crown land applicants a fairly clear and consistent idea of what to expect. However, implementation can vary from region to region, depending on things like local planning processes and agreements with Indigenous governments. Currently, the government uses the Front Counter BC offices as a one-window approach for natural resource applications. And I should talk about Crown land disposition tools. To oversimplify, there are 4 main tools the province uses to manage and dispose of Crown land, and all get their authority under the Land Act. Land Act reserves are the designations that the province puts on Crown land that it wants to keep for specific purposes. If land is in a Land Act reserve, applications are rejected automatically. For example, coastal islands under a certain size are in a blanket reserve against disposition, and highways gravel pits are in individual Land Act reserves. Licenses of occupation are used for temporary or short-term rental of Crown land, and they can range from a few months to 10 or 20 years. They're non-exclusive, meaning that licensees, people that hold the licenses of occupation, aren't allowed to prevent others from using the land, and the province can issue non-conflicting tenures over the same area. They're not meant for substantial buildings. They're the lightest, least secure form of tenure. Leases are generally 30 years, sometimes longer. They provide exclusive use, usually for industrial, commercial, recreational, or residential purposes. They can be used as security for financing. When they expire, the application process must be repeated under the then current policy, including Indigenous consultation. They're used when buildings and other significant improvements are proposed. Now, Crown grants are the vehicle by which the province sells Crown land, and technically a Crown grant is the deed that transfers ownership. That transfer is subject to retention of some rights by the Crown, in particular, the undersurface rights. It may also be subject to certain conditions, such as water access only, to prevent future claims for a right to road access. The different natural resource ministries have specific disposition documents based on these 4 basic tools, as set out in their legislation and regulations, and all those tools come from British property or common law. Okay, time for another unpredictable change of topic. You already know that the First Nations Leadership Council is made up of the BC Assembly of First Nations, the First Nations Summit, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And I understand that it was formed at the request of the Gordon Campbell government to create a single point of contact on Indigenous issues. Public servants see that it can sometimes be an uneasy alliance, given the different mandates of the organizations. The province would love to rely on the Leadership Council as a way of meeting its consultation obligations on broad policies and legislation. But as the members of the council are clear, it doesn't have a mandate to bind any individual First Nation government. The bottom line is that the provincial government will continue to struggle with how to consult appropriately with Indigenous governments on policy and legislation issues. I talk in more detail about the province's approach to Indigenous consultation in my podcast series called Introduction to Indigenous Relations in British Columbia. I put it together in response to Section 92.3 of the Calls to Action. It's meant to introduce non-Indigenous people to the Federal Indian Act, Aboriginal Rights and Title, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties, and the history of Aboriginal and Crown relations. Like these videos, they're free for public use, and you can find the links on my website. Now, you might decide to hire a consultant to represent you to government. It's your call, but I usually don't recommend that. Just as you want to meet with the decision makers, the people at the highest level, the provincial government wants to meet with you directly to understand your interests and build a relationship. And putting a third party in the middle can make that harder. And consultants operating in BC have to follow the Lobbyists Transparency Act. Lobbying is very broadly defined in BC if, for pay, and I emphasize, for pay, someone attempts on your behalf to influence a decision of government, any decision, no matter how trivial, that person is lobbying. Even if your consultant is simply arranging a meeting with a public servant or a minister for you, and even if they don't attend, they are technically lobbying. To be clear, chiefs and councils meeting with a minister are not considered to be lobbying. A consultant sitting with them is. To avoid being fined under the Act, a consultant has to register the issue or project they're discussing. I don't expect anyone to care if a consultant is fined, but the registry is accessible to the public, and journalists regularly scan it to see if there's anything interesting. And the registrar reports regularly to the Legislative Assembly. So, if you want to keep your project or issue confidential, you may want to avoid using a consultant for provincial government meetings. I'll end this session and the series with one suggestion. Keep in mind the difference between how the province and Indigenous peoples define Aboriginal title. To keep it simple, I'm going to generalize wildly, and it's what I do. Formally, the provincial government sees Aboriginal title as a burden on fee simple title, on Crown ownership. I understand that Indigenous peoples, again, please forgive the generalization, see it as a deep responsibility for stewardship of the land and preserving its resources for future generations. The province functionally interprets that as a claim of absolute ownership. In my opinion, those fundamental differences need to be more widely acknowledged and formally addressed before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples concept of consent can be adopted in a meaningful way. Okay, I'll end this video and this video series here. If you have any questions, and I know you might because I just touched on a lot of stuff briefly, my email address is on my website, as are the other resources I've mentioned in these videos. Thank you for watching.